Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I will be brief because obviously you came to hear our speaker and our discussant, not me. I'm Robert Bijarek from Temple University, Japan. I'm extremely happy that Nikhila will give us summary and overview of her work, and then we will have Stephanie as a discussant, and we will open for Q&A. So Nikhila, thanks again for joining us from Kanagawa, and Stephanie from Brighton, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for giving me an opportunity to make this presentation. This is my first book talk, and the book was released in September 2020. Good morning to all of you in London. Good evening to my Japanese friends, and good afternoon to my Indian friends. And Stephanie, also, it's been a very hectic month for you, but thanks a lot for joining today in my book talk. So let me right away share the screen. Yeah. So the name of the book is Mobility as Capability, Women in the Indian Informal Economy. So what I would like to do is give a 25 minutes presentation. It's a 200-page book. So I'm trying my level best to do justice to the main takeaways from this book. Let me just give you an overview of what I would like to do in the coming 25 minutes. So first, I'll just give you a background of what encouraged me to take up the study, in the contextual setting of the study, and the main theoretical framework which I have used to analyze mobility as capability. I've introduced a new concept of transformational mobility in this book, which kind of challenges the development thought, which looks at paid work as something which enhances autonomy. Then I've introduced an innovative scale to measure gendered mobility, which also I'll try to kind of give a glimpse to the audience. And then we look into the pathways. What are the causal conditions which can result in transformational mobility in the framework of informal work? And then I try to kind of expound the contrasting theories which have emerged from the informal work in the context of fisheries. So let me right away get into the background of what encouraged me to look into this aspect of mobility as capability in the gender and work context. So women, work, and well-being are closely related, and work has become a very defining aspect for individuals, and especially for women in the context of globalization and feminization of workforce. So what we can see is many scholars in the development thought have analyzed that globally, there is predominance of women in the lowest paid and the least permanent activities in export-oriented sectors. Maybe starting with Benaria and then Diane Elson, and there are so many scholars who have analyzed this aspect. So one can think of whether these export-oriented manufacturing is really inclusive in terms of providing opportunities for women, or are these opportunities for exploitation in the global value supply chains or the export-oriented manufacturing. So this has been an aspect which has been in development thought for some time. And this has really interested me, this theme, because at the macro level, we tend to promote participation of women in the labor market, and especially in developing countries like India. So this deserves special attention from the policy makers' perspective as well. So when you look at India, there is more than 90% of women employed in the informal economy. So when we are talking about a neoliberal framework, so this large section of women, when they are employed in informal economy, whether mobility associated with informal work is going to enhance their capabilities is a critical question. So it is in this background that I have tried to analyze mobility as capability. Now let's get into the contextual setting of this study. Why the contextual setting is unique is because I'm looking at Kerala, which is the southernmost state in India, which is a very socially progressive state. And it has positive development indicators. As you know, for the past um, 10 to 20 decades, we have recorded high human development indices and gender development indices, almost zero point 0.7 plus. So in such a scenario, we would like to look at the informal women workers in the fisheries sector. And why fisheries? Because Kerala is a state with an extensive coastal area, and fisheries has an integral role in the Kerala's economy, and women remain an integral part of post-harvest fisheries. So in this situation, we need to analyze Kerala's situation of women and understand whether the Kerala model of development is a myth or a reality. Because the Kerala model of development has been talking about the exalted status of women in terms of high literacy, greater participation, empowerment, etc. So given such a context, is it true that informal women workers in Kerala who are linked to the export-oriented units, do they have uh, autonomy? Do they have mobility, which is autonomy enhancing? So this is the contextual setting which I have analyzed in the book. Now, I just want to explain to my friends the two groups of workers which I have made a comparative case study in this book. One is the self-employed women fish vendors, and another is the unit-based peeling workers. So these are the two prominent groups of women workers in fisheries sector. And when we look at the self-employed women fish vendors, in fact, in the southern districts of Kerala, you can find majority of women in fish vending, while in the case of the northern districts of Kerala, it is still a male bastion. So within the occupation itself, within Kerala, you can see this difference in participation of women in fish vending. Now, if we look at unit-based peeling work, these seafood processing work are mostly integrated with large companies which are export-oriented manufacturing units. But from the picture which I have shown, this is a small dingy shed where you have 20 to 30 women workers who work continuously for, say, 5 to 8 hours at a stretch, doing the kind of work which I'm just showing you in the PowerPoint, cleaning, peeling of squids, shrimp, cuttlefish, etc. And there are no contractual agreements between the workers and the employer. So it is purely casual work. And they are given less than minimum wage, and the piece rate wages are at that time, this is 2014 data, which was 150 per day, which is less than £2 a day for 8 to 9 hours of work. So these are very oppressive and exploitative conditions of work, which you can find in a state like Kerala, where the development indicators are very favorable towards women. And they work in unhealthy conditions of work. There is lack of basic infrastructure facilities. When I visited most of these units, they didn't have any facility for washing hands properly, or toilet facilities, or places to have food. So these were completely unhealthy conditions. And so there is definite evidence of lack of decent work norms in practice. So given this context of Kerala, and with the informal work as the frame of reference, in this book, I have tried to expound the mobility as a capability aspect for women in the informal economy. Now, let me just give you an overall idea of capability approach framework. I'm very sure that those who are from the development economics background will definitely know the capability approach. Uh, And I have adopted Professor Amartya Sen's capability approach. It has come because of the inadequacy of resource-oriented evaluation of individual well-being. So it's a very open normative framework for evaluation of individual well-being. So the three critical concepts which comprise this framework is functionings, capability, and agency. So functionings are the beings and doings and the achievements, while capability is much more broader concept, which comprises of the notions of freedom in a very positive sense. That is, the opportunities you have regarding the life you may like to lead. So it's basically about well-being freedoms, which can help in the flourishing of human beings, and which can enhance the well-being freedoms for all. So why I use the capability approach is because of the way capability approach can include the gender aspect, because capability approach believes in the equality for all. So when you talk about gender inequalities, it becomes crucial to analyze the gender aspect of development within the capability approach framework. In the informal work by women, I have included the capability approach to analyze mobility as just a functioning. That is, it's just a being and a doing where women are able to move outside the household for paid work. But then what is capability in that context? Capability becomes the transformational mobility, which is the new concept which I have introduced, which means the freedom and the ability to move outside the household without constraints from others. It may be to any spaces, personal spaces, social spaces, or community spaces, not just workspaces. So it is a broader concept, and it enhances the freedoms, and it is autonomy in mobility, which implies freedom of movement in the real sense. So let me just this is just a glimpse of the capability approach framework, and I would like to show how I have used it in this book to analyze transformation mobility. This is the conceptual framework. So if women move from the household for paid work, it can be either not transformational mobility or a transformational mobility state. So only if the movement is transformational mobility, it can result in household autonomy. So this is the aspect which I'm trying to analyze using the two groups of women workers and their experiences, and through their in-depth interviews, whether the movement or mobility for paid work outside the household will result in transformational mobility and thereby household autonomy. Now, to understand transformational mobility, what I realized was that you need to measure the current mobility domains of women workers. Without having a scale to measure the mobilities, we cannot understand where do they stand. Do they have transformational mobility or not? So you can see this mobility ladder, which is being based on the RASH rating scale model, which helped me in constructing this new scale of permissibility of mobility. So if you look at the, this is slightly technical, which I can, I'll make it kind of, user-friendly by making it lighter, by showing that these steps, which you can see in this ladder, shows that the constraints on movement increases as you climb up the ladder. So when you are at the top of the ladder, which means that you have transformational mobility. So at the top of the ladder, what you have is you have mobility for entertainment, personal visits, and socializing, which also includes attending election meetings and other, political activities, etc. So if you are at the top with transformational mobility, then you are the one with autonomy in mobility. So which is what we try to capture in this book, so that you will know that there are domains of mobility where women have most constraints as well as least constraints. So let me just make it slightly clearer. The work-related mobility, which you see at the bottom of the ladder, it's the one with the least constraints because it is a necessity to go out and work. And for the religious needs, the next step, it's a medium level constraint for the women. It's a question of whether she requires permission to go to the church or the temple, etc. So when it comes to social and cultural needs, again, it becomes more difficult. She has to have permission to attend all these kinds of events. And in the case of entertainment and personal visits and political activities, at many times it's very difficult to get permission. In fact, from the scale, what you can do is you can map the women workers based on their mobility measures. So if you look into the book, you will see a technical appendix where one can take out the measures and plot women workers on the basis of their mobility levels. So I found it very useful in terms of understanding the various domains of gendered mobility. And it was really an eye-opener, even in a state like Kerala, to see that there are domains of mobility which are not accessible to women. So for example, there is one which I have quoted in the book. I cannot, this is Leela, a 46-year-old peeling worker, who says, I cannot even go to work without my husband's permission. So she's at the very bottom level of this scale of permissibility of mobility. So with the help of this scale of permissibility of mobility, I've been able to understand the domains of mobility of women. So now, once you have these women workers, both the fish vendors and the informal peeling workers, mapped and plotted on the basis of transformational mobility and the ones without transformational mobility, you can analyze the causal conditions which can result in transformational mobility. So that is what I did using a qualitative comparative analysis and try to understand what are the causal conditions which can result in transformational mobility. So you have workers with transformational mobility and without transformational mobility. And it is very well clear that there were very few women who had transformational mobility because of all those constraints and the main factors which came out, which resulted in transformational mobility. I've just plotted because this is not the way to show the qualitative comparative analysis. You have all those pathways, but because of time constraint, I have just put everything together. So one can see that there are economic factors. If women have asset ownership, it kind of acts as a causative factor which can lead to transformational mobility. Then human capital factors, if you are slightly educated, most of them were either primary school educated or high school educated and not above that, because they belong to a particular caste and marginalized community in Kerala. And so if the women is slightly highly educated than the spouse, there was a tendency to have transformational mobility in terms of autonomy in mobility. So then other factors like social factors, the caste, age, then spousal violence, which was very symbolic, of the patriarchy that exists within the community. So what you can see in the book is that I have tried to analyze the causal conditions which can result in transformational mobility of women in both groups of workers. And it kind of comes out that there are complex interactions. It is not just one linear fit which can result in transformational mobility. Given the context and given the cultural setting, there are various interactions which can result in transformational mobility among women workers. Like, for example, for instance, just an example, there were group of widows. Among them, there were this combination of being widow and having asset ownership, leading to transformational mobility. So you can find all these combinations, which I have explained in the book. Again, because of paucity, I'm not going into the details. So once we have found out the transformational mobility aspect of both groups of workers, what I have tried to analyze is I've tried to go in depth and do interviews of these workers, both peeling workers as well as the fish vendors, and try to find out what are the core concerns of these women workers and what emerges as theories. So for this, I have used a sociological approach of classical grounded theory. I believe sociologists who are here will very much understand that everything is data in classical grounded theory. And it was very interesting as an economist to adopt this approach and try to analyze. Now, first of all, let me just say one more thing, that I have used mixed method research. So that's why you find all these combinations of analysis in the study. So what emerged from these in-depth interviews was that in the case of peeling workers who are engaged in work related to export-oriented manufacturing, they have become kind of subordinated selves at three levels. Say, for example, at the workplace, they had a feeling of being trapped and helpless. So the mobility which was there as a paid work, doing paid work outside the household, did not empower them in any sense in terms of autonomy, because of the working conditions and because of the patriarchal setting in the workplace. They really felt trapped. So there was this reconciliation and subordination at the workplace, which kind of trickled down to the household and the individual level, where they were kind of accepting and conforming to the patriarchal norms, and there was least resistance. So they never tried to bring about change or effect change. Say for example, the working conditions. To the groups of workers whom I have talked, it was very difficult for them to express the desire to have toilet facilities or proper drinking water facilities within the units, because they always said that there were these supervisors who never bothered what the women workers wanted. So it was kind of conforming and accepting to the norms which were there. So, so this also led to a kind of low self-esteem, and there was no capacity to aspire in terms of bringing about changes either at the workplace or at the society, and they always felt that they're doing something very demeaning. But in fact, they are integral part of post-harvest fisheries. So if they don't do this work, it was not possible to, for the export-oriented units to export their final products. But as many scholars have expounded this, these skills are considered a continuation of the domestic activities for women, which results in these types of outcomes. And this has clearly come out from the in-depth interviews of workers through grounded theory, and the theory of subordinated self clearly brings out these core concerns of peeling workers. Now, another contrasting aspect has come out when one analyzed the interviews with fish vendors. So let us just see what is the difference. So in the case of fish vendors, what has come out clearly is that they have a strong group identity. Though they are informal, self-employed workers in the same fisheries sector, they do have a group identity, and they their occupation gives them a kind of sense of competence and confidence as fish vendors. Probably it is the kind of work that they do in terms of negotiating with wholesale merchants, greater interactions in the market, greater interactions with households, and greater interactions with educated women who are their customers, etc. So probably, and this is what one could assess from the interviews. So this group identity of women has in fact helped them to bring about changes as well in work setting, not to a large extent because the patriarchal structures are kind of embedded, but still in the marketplaces they have been able to capture some space for vending, and then they have been able to bring about, transportation facilities, and there are cooperatives which work for them, like there are groups which support them as fish vendors. For example, there are these international collective in support of fish workers. They do a lot of negotiation. These representatives from fish vendors, they do a lot of negotiation with these groups to bring about changes. So you find this contrasting experiences of fish vendors and peeling workers. So though these fish vendors within the household are accepting the patriarchal structure, and they may not be household autonomy in terms of having autonomy in mobility or transformational mobility to that extent, but in the public space as a group, they are being able to influence and bring about changes. So this is something really interesting, which has come out from the analysis of mobility as capability for these two groups of workers. And plus, the self-employed aspect of fish vendors have given them a capacity to aspire, and they feel that they can give a better better living standards to the next generation. So, so from these studies, what emerges is that even if work is linked to global production chains or factory-oriented work, it may not bring in autonomy or agency, because it depends on the kind of working conditions and the self-esteem that can come from the work. So work becomes work has a defining role in boosting your sense of competence and self-esteem. So let me just come to the main takeaways which I have expounded in this book. So the story that comes out from this analysis of both fish vendors and the peeling workers is that transformational mobility is the capability, and it is not just paid work outside the household that will enable women to have autonomy, but it has to be transformational. So it has to be a state of non-domination, which actually is absent among majority of the women workers with whom I could interact. So what comes out is that work mobility is kind of bounded capability. It is not a capability which will enhance your freedoms. So from the policy perspective, if one is looking at macro policies which aims to promote greater participation of women in the labor market, then having increased work in the informal economy may not be a sufficient condition for autonomy and agency of women. So what we say is that if you want to push up the GDP to a 10% target, and if you at the same time you want to increase the labor market participation of women, one has to be very careful as to what type of work we are planning to generate in the economy, because ultimately it is the well-being of women which matters and which will be sustainable in the development of any economy. Now, another aspect which comes out clearly from this analysis is that even in a context, or even in the context of Kerala, which is a socially progressive state, the gender relations are basically shaped by the patriarchal power of both the neoliberal markets and the state. And of course, within the household, there are the cultural conditions which again reinforce the gender relations and which makes women subjugated. So it is a situation of subordination in terms of both fish vendors and the peeling workers. Another aspect which is critical in this context is that there is great intersectionality of gender and caste, which has exacerbated the vulnerabilities of women workers in the fisheries sector. So most of the women, both in the fish vending as well as the peeling work, they belong to either the other backward castes or the scheduled castes. So the caste aspect has played a particular role, and this needs to be taken into account when one brings out development policies to improve the skills and educational capital of these workers. Plus, since they are vulnerable workers, there has to be regulatory norms to bring about decent work norms in these units for sustainable human development. Another aspect which comes out clearly when we talk to these workers are the triple burden and the time poverty of women workers. Many of them would like to interact and participate in activities in group activities like, say, Kudumbashri, which are neighborhood groups and other women-oriented activities, but they do face the triple burden of productive work outside, household chores, and the care work, which all these become very invisible in the policy landscape. So they have a time poverty, so which means that when you have to have social protection and welfare policies, these realities should be taken into account to improve the well-being of women workers, especially in informal sector. So the main takeaway, which I would like to say, is that the exalted status of women in Kerala is a myth, from with which I started, whether it is a model, whether the model is a myth or a reality. So it seems to be a myth because there's the shadow of empowerment. But if you see, not only in the case of informal workers, there has been rising crimes against women, and there are various issues which come to the fore. Comes to the fore, and as you can see, even in the representation of women in a legislative assembly or the Parliament of India, you can find that Kerala has very low representation, I think less than 5%. So this is not a transformative model for women, which is currently in existence in Kerala. So one should say that the exalted status of women in Kerala is a myth. So what should we do to go forward? So I have extensively, expounded the concept of collective agency of informal women workers in my concluding chapter in the book. So what we can see is that in the informal work context, both fish vendors as well as peeling workers, it's very difficult to have individual capabilities in terms to enhance their freedoms, because they are in such a situation where the patriarchal structure as well as the norms make them difficult to improve their capabilities. So the focus has to be on collective agency, which will come through the collective capabilities of informal women workers. So with which what I mean is there has to be shared goals and concerns, and we should facilitate collective agency by helping through, say, cooperatives, which are really working well in countries like Japan. So here too, there are cooperatives, which I have not mentioned in the book because at that time I had not looked into Japan. So here, what happens in the fisheries sector and fish processing sector is that they do have cooperatives. They're able to know how much profit the company is making. Here, in the case of Kerala, the women are totally unaware of the chain and how much profit the companies are making. So they are having wages much below the minimum wage, and they are unable to even ask for wage increases. So in this case, collective agency of informal women workers become critical to improve the freedoms and human flourishing in the context of informal work. So to conclude, I would like to say that, you know, reconceptualizing mobility and capability for women, it will also require reimagining women and their agentic power at the center of development discourse. So I would like to leave with an image of a woman. It actually represents the majority of women who remain invisible, but they are at the center of development activities. Thank you so much. I hope I have been able to do justice to the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikhila. It's a really powerful presentation, and I cannot pretend to be an expert on this, but I really learned a lot. So thanks a lot. And Stephanie, the floor is yours as a discussant, and then we'll open to Q&A from the audience.
So thank you very much for inviting me to be a discussant of a very interesting book. And it's great to see the book evolve from a PhD originally at the University of Manchester. It's great to see the work, the research evolve from a PhD at the University of Manchester to a very much further developed book published by Cambridge University Press. So congratulations on that journey. It's quite an achievement. I'm going to focus a bit more on the question that was asked, because I think that Nikhila's just given a really excellent review of the book and summary of the book and the key arguments in the book. So I'll briefly reflect on the book itself and on the content. But then what I want to do is to think much more in terms of the implications in relation to development policy and how development policies can be advanced to promote collective capabilities. But I think also very much in a context where informal work and the informal economy is, if anything, expanding and growing in many countries. It's not something that is contracting. So firstly, just a few broad comments on the book itself. I think it's a really important achievement, both analytically and empirically. Analytically, especially because of the way it draws on Sen's capability approach and applies that to an analysis, quite nuanced analysis of different types of work, of women's capabilities in the context of the constraints of patriarchy, of social norms, of regulations, and of work environments. And empirically, I think it's also very important, makes a very important contribution in terms of the focus on fish. There's a lot of work on agriculture, women in agriculture. There's a lot of work on women workers in global value chains, but fish often gets missed out. There's less research on that particular area. And I think that is a very, very important dimension that we need to be looking at, and it contributes a lot in that respect. I think the key argument of the book is I mean, I can only agree with it, that simply women going out to work, in other words, increased work mobility, does not necessarily on its own. It might be an aspect and a dimension, but on its own, it isn't enough to enhance capability and agency and to achieve what Nikhila very nicely analyzes as transformational mobility. And I think that argument is made very well in the book, and I think again has just been repeated in the presentation. What's particularly interesting, of course, is Kerala, which is a part of India I love, is that Kerala has been presented because of progress on so many fronts, in terms of growth, social indicators, etc. It's been presented as a great achievement for women as well. But what Nikhila's book really does is to unpack that and question that and say, yes, there have been achievements, but, and the but is very important, there are still significant constraints for women, particularly in her case study of fish, that restrict and constrain that, and that those achievements are therefore to date very limited. So that takes on to the kind of what's the implication? So what? So where do we go from here, and where does this book take us in terms of this journey of trying to enhance policies or have better development policies that enhance transformational mobility ultimately, and that being an ultimate goal? I think the first thing is, it's a general point, I think context matters. Now, obviously, this book is based on two very specific comparative case study in Kerala and in India. And India is a country which has always had a significant amount of informal work. Over 90% of the labour force is in informal work, which means that these workers lack contracts, they lack social protection, and often, but not always, and we'll get onto that, lack organisation, independent organisation as well, and they lack security. But of course, the issue with a case study is and case studies provide very important insights, as this one does, is it's difficult to generalize from case studies. So we need to always be keeping that bigger context in play. The second thing, I think, in terms of the implications, is because the focus is on India, where informal work is so well established and has played such a significant role for such a long time. It loses what we need to remember, that in many countries where there was not previously so much informal work, that is rapidly increasing. So in fact, some of the lessons from the India example and the Kerala example have relevance in countries, even in the UK and the US, for example, which traditionally had much stronger formal employment. More precarious informal work is becoming increasingly the norm, the gig economy being an obvious example of that. So therefore, there are very important lessons here that I think we need to draw. The next point that I think is really important is in relation to the comparison of self-employed and waged work, waged labour, in terms of comparing the fish vendors who are self-employed and the fish peelers who are waged labour working in those export supply chains. And I thought it was very interesting, the findings that the women who are self-employed have a better sense of esteem, a better level of collective capabilities than the women who are in the export processing, who are really at the bottom of the what we would call the bottom of the food chain, in terms of very poor conditions, very low self-esteem, very poor organisation, and where the patriarchal norms of male supervisors, very dominant male supervisors, are brought in. And I think that finding is certainly a finding that many other export sectors, workers in many other export sectors has found, and I think there's an important but that is possibly could be better explored in the book. And of course, I do come from a global value chain perspective in terms of analysing these things, so I do have a particular bias here, which is that there are examples in other sectors and in other countries where women in very similar circumstances have been able to organise. And being able to organise not just at a local level in the way, say, the fish vendors have been able to, but have been able to organise through international connections along the value chain, and to use those connections to leverage change and to leverage improvements in their own working conditions and therefore their own collective capabilities. And one example certainly that I've worked on would be Kenya Flowers, an example where 10 or 20 years ago you would have found what we did. Research showed very similar kinds of conditions for workers in Kenyan flower sector as the fish peelers, but through pressure on supermarkets, on Kenyan government, on a whole range of actors, a lot of improvements have been put forward. Now that doesn't stop or negate still the underlying problem of the patriarchal constraints, if you like, on transformational mobility, but it certainly has shown to take women further up the mobility ladder. So the fact that you find in one case study that it's poor doesn't necessarily mean it's all doom and gloom. So that brings us on to then what to do about it, how to promote those transformational capabilities. And I think the book touches on it. It's great to see Sewa, particularly in relation to the organisation of self-employed fish vendors. Sewa, the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, is a registered trade union, so it is a recognised trade union in India. That was a big struggle for the women who established it. And it's played really a quite critical role both within India in organising women workers, not only self-employed workers, but also in value chains. It's not probably as strong in value chains, but it has played a role in organising contract labour, etc., contract workers, home-based workers in global value chains. And also played an important role in leveraging international organisations, particularly the ILO, to have stronger policies for informal workers to try and promote better protection for them. In relation to the trade unions, therefore, traditionally many trade unions are quite male dominated. They tend to overlook women workers, but again, there is change. Sewa is a recognised trade union. There are many trade unions who are beginning to address issues around gender, and particularly where women themselves have become more organised. So I really do agree with the book's proposition that collective agency, collective capabilities are really critical to improvement for women. I think what we need to think through more, and of course it will vary a lot by context, is how that can be organised and how women can organise. And I think historically, and spending a last 15 years of my life based in Manchester, women have only ever really progressed through their own organisation and collective activity. So I think that's really critical. So that gives you the kind of bottom-up perspective, but there's also a very strong top-down perspective that needs to be brought in, which is how to leverage policy change, how to enhance social protection, how to improve the rules and the norms, both within companies and within governments, local government and within national government. And I think Sewa provides one example, but there are many others of where through organisation and through international collaboration between organisations, which is really important in a global economy, you can begin to get those changes taking place in a top-down way, but where you still need that bottom-up mobilisation, if you like, and collective organisation to keep governments, companies, etc., to account and to improve all forms of social protection and security for workers, enhance their formality and their recognition and their visibility. Just the last few words, because I don't think we can really, I mean, obviously the research for this book was done a number of years ago, but I think we really do briefly at least have to think about what are the implications of COVID for COVID-19 for this situation. And there is certainly a lot of evidence coming out and a number of studies coming out that COVID has really set back women's empowerment, particularly possibly by 30 years. And certainly if you take a doom and gloom scenario on it, I think that is a strong argument. Of course, one of the ironies in the whole COVID example of lockdown is anybody working in the food sector was often exempt from the lockdown. So I don't know exactly what happened with the fish, and there was a lot of disruption in production of food and certainly of food value chains. But in many countries, in most countries, people had to continue eating, and therefore, even when you got lockdown, you got exemption. But, and that's a big but, that might be in relation to work, going to work, but in terms of all other mobilities that are discussed and analysed in Nikhila's book, those mobilities have been seriously restricted. And there is a lot of evidence that women have been constrained and forced back into their homes, back into patriarchal norms and controls, which in previous years they had been able to move beyond, and also in many instances increases of gender-based violence, increased pressures on women in terms of their caring roles, etc., etc. So I think this is something we need to think about. We mustn't just let the whole movement back by 30 years. We need to think very positively about how to move forward and how to ensure that any build back through COVID, following COVID, involves enhanced promoting gender equality and therefore enhanced transformational mobility in the longer run. And I think this has both got to be done from a bottom-up perspective in terms of the organisation of women themselves, as already discussed, but also through top-down pressures. And I think there are some pressures there. McKinsey, for example, has done some research that says that if the build back is not done in a gender equitable way, that the growth will be far less than if it is done in a more gender equitable way. So there is research coming out of McKinsey, Gates Foundation, even the IMF, which is arguing that there has to be gender equality in this. But I think what Nikhila's book shows very clearly is that simple gender equality at work, for example, isn't sufficient. With that, you need to have the more transformational mobility where women themselves can benefit and really promote a much more a vibrant future economic growth than would be if it was just left to the powers that be and the existing situation. So a very, very important book. I really welcome it, and I think a lot. It should inform learning on future policies going forward in this very challenging circumstance.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So I think now we have time for about half an hour of questions. So if you have a question, just use the chat, send a question to everyone, and then I will recognize you. You can turn off your microphone and your camera and ask the question.
Hi, I'm Manish Dabada, a faculty in School of International Studies, JNU Delhi. Congratulations, Nikhila, for your book. I just wanted to know, I mean, obviously I haven't read the book, nor am I an expert in the area in which you've written, but just out of curiosity, I wanted to ask, you have also worked in the government. So how does government see this issue, and what sort of experience did you have that, okay, this is how the problem was seen by the government, and these were the policies that came out after thinking on this specific sector, informal sector, and the role of women?
So Nikhila, if you'd like to answer it. Thanks.
Thank you, Manish. A very interesting question. Yes, my 15 years of experience in the government of India, yes, it in fact helps to kind of analyze the situation of women workers from the perspective of the government as well. So what has happened in the development policies from the government's perspective is that there is a kind of invisibility of informal women workers, especially in the case of fisheries sector. I think Stephanie also just mentioned that they haven't recognized some types of work. So when you take the definition of fish worker in the government documents, the peeling workers do not come in any of the category. So fish worker is directly related to, say, fish vending, buying. So where do these women workers fall? So the category itself has become difficult. So only if you identify a particular category, then in the government, they'll have a policy oriented to the target group. So that itself is a basic problem in improving the conditions of such invisible workers. Plus, in terms of imposing, say, for example, decent work norms, we do have documents which talk at length on the types of working conditions which should be there in export-oriented units. And as Stephanie has rightly said, I visited textile sector in special economic zones in Andhra Pradesh. So excellent management. The management provides all kinds of facilities to the women workers who come, and some of them have even provided bicycles to go back home. So you find heterogeneity in terms of how the regulatory measures are being implemented from, in one state in comparison to another state. So that's what surprised me the most, because in the Kerala model of development, even as a person born and brought up in Kerala, I never expected such scenario in export-oriented manufacturing units, because we do have policies for labor protection and enforcement of welfare measures at these kind of units, but somehow the implementation of these regulatory measures were absent. So this kind of heterogeneity one finds depending on which state, which context, which sector, etc. So I hope that helps in answering your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, and congratulations again from India.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nikhila. The next question is from Gareth Wall. If you can turn on your mic and.
Thanks, Robert, and congratulations, Nicola, on the book launch. It's a really and a great presentation. I haven't obviously read any of your papers from your thesis, so apologies for not getting into the absolute detail. So I think most of my comments, I'm pretty sure, are things that will be reflected in the book and in the thesis, but just in case it's helpful either for reflecting, but also for possible future work or suggestions for others to be looking at. So a few things. First off, you didn't mention Martha Nussbaum, who's done a lot of work, who helped develop the capabilities approach with Amartya Sen. And you seem to mention Amartya. I know he's a celebrity in India, but Martha's work in Kerala, in Trivandrum, on women's work in her book Women and Human Development in 2000 is exactly based on this sort of work. And I know you'll know the work. I'm pretty sure you'll be referencing it and things, but I was interested as to why you just frame it as Amartya's work capabilities approach and not Nussbaum and Sen develop it together, and particularly the women's empowerment side of it. It came a lot from Martha in her literature. Alongside that, there's a few things. I mean, the idea of Kerala as a progressive state, you mentioned it's seen as a progressive state. It's clearly not a progressive state. Anyone who's been there knows it's not gender progressive. But the idea that somehow higher education and health indicators means it's progressive seems a strange narrative, which obviously everyone has challenged, but I'm interested as to why you think it's still worth stating that Kerala's a progressive state. I'm looking, you mentioned collective capabilities, which both, particularly Amartya, but also Martha, do push back a bit on. And you don't really mention what you mean by collective capabilities. It seems there's collective action through cooperatives and through unions, SAVA, the Kudambasharis and elsewhere. But it doesn't seem too much as to what actually you're meaning collective capabilities. There is a whole subset of work on collective capabilities, which, as I say, both Martha and Amartya push back on a bit. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more on that. And just to finish, and again, it's a kind of congratulatory thing, is I definitely highly recommend, if you can, and I'm happy to help organise to present at CDS in Kerala with I mean, they could definitely get John Korean and KP Cannon, who's worked obviously on the fisheries and on the informal sector commission, along with, it may even be possible to get Professor Isaac as the finance minister to join. And so I would think your book launch doing a Kerala launch there would be very highly welcomed and should give some quite interesting policy consideration as well. But congratulations and thanks.
Thank you so much. I think you have asked almost every aspect, from the theoretical framework to why Kerala model to collective capabilities. Yes, Gareth, very interesting questions. Quickly, I can just answer a few points. Sense capability approach, I had deliberately adopted sense capability approach. I found Martha Nussbaum's very interesting, but one thing was that since she has those central capabilities, you know, the 10 basic central capabilities, and then moving on to expanding them, I found somehow some kind of a limitation in using those with that set limits. So, but since CA was more open in terms of, you know, inclusiveness of various aspects as well as diverse conditions. So in my study, it was more about the cultural context plus the gender. So I found the sense capability approach more pliable and useful as a conceptual framework to analyze mobility. In fact, Malta has identified mobility itself as one of the capabilities. But then there were certain things which, you know, I found more in sync with sense capability approach. I hope that helps. So that's why I had adopted sense approach. And the next question was about women's status of women in Kerala. Of course, we find, in fact, why the Kerala model of development is being talked about so much is because, of course, we have these two extremes where you do have those educated, highly educated and empowered women on the one end, and at the other extreme you do have you know, marginalized communities where there is this intersectionality of gender and caste, which results in a very low levels of living, as well as, you know, as oppression and exploitation at the workplace as well as in the households. So it becomes a very interesting case to analyze, and probably if, you know, if one could, I feel Kerala offers a lot of scope for further research, not only in fisheries, in various kinds of occupations where women are engaged. Say, for example, you have IT sector. Now it's coming up on a big way. You have a lot of women who are educated and working in IT sector. So how are they placed? Even these are, you know, invisible in some sense because they are not in public spaces basically, but then of course they are not informal as well. But as Stephanie was mentioning, there may be cases where you have, you know, consultancies on the increase. So these are basically, you know, self-employed. So how do they fare? So we do not have idea as researchers as to how these are being played out in the context of Kerala. So it will be very interesting to analyze various sectors. So fisheries was one place which I wanted to look into because of all these characteristics. As I mentioned, you know, they are not even identified as fish workers. So that's one aspect. And coming to collective capabilities, of course, I have mentioned about the collective agency. Of course, the agency comes from the collective capability aspect. It is about those shared goals and, you know, how at the individual level you are unable to, you know, achieve what you value in life. But as a collective, say for example, in the case of women workers, as a collective, they wanted better modes of transport from harbor to the market, or to cross the river, they wanted a boat. So as a collective, they were able to represent to the local representative that they wanted, you know, such and such transportation. So this is like a collective capability. As an individual, he or she may not have been able to exercise that choice of going there and, you know, asking for such help. But as a group and as a group identity, they had a group goal of achieving it. So that's about collect. And I have extensively, I think Peter Evans was the first person who mentioned collective capabilities as a term. So I think I have mentioned it in the book as well. And I have dealt with at length in the book. Of course, because of paucity of time, I kind of, compressed the whole book into 25 minutes. So yes, probably it didn't come through clearly during the presentation. Sorry for that, but I hope that helps in clarifying the query. And thanks a lot. Of course, it will be nice if we can have the last point where we can launch this book in Kerala, as you suggested. And I believe in Center for Development Studies, there are quite a number of researchers who do a lot of interesting work in informal economy. I have read a lot of them during my PhD time, of course. After that, of course, it's been 5 years. A lot more must have come, which I have I'm yet to get my hands on. So definitely it will be nice, and I'm ready to join any kind of cooperative effort towards improving, the knowledge and understanding of informal economy in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next question is from Tulika Tripathi. If you can turn on your microphone and ask your question, the camera. Thank you.
Hi Nikhila. Congrats. Sorry, I'm not switching on my video because I am sitting somewhere in remote area where internet is not very nice. So I'm using my mobile network. That's why I wrote there. So actually, I also myself have been working a little bit on from the empowerment perspective, and there I also try to conceptualize mobility as a capability, because I feel that's a very important resource in accessing all other facilities. Most of the things are outside your house. So that's where I was trying to, because from my analysis, and I have used NFHS data for that, I have presented this paper also in STCA. So there I feel there are levels of worker, and around those levels, this mobility, capability of mobility will vary, and so the empowerment. Since you have only looked at the fisherwomen, you got some kind of homogeneous level of capability of mobility. So what is your understanding about it? Whether the different levels of workers and different state will have different kind of capability of mobility for the women, because as you rightly said that social norms are very important there. So that's my question, and congratulations for your book.
Shall I, Robert? Yeah. Thank you, Tulika. Yeah. Thank you, Tulika. Thanks a lot. It's very interesting to know that you are taking mobility as capability, and a very interesting question. Of course, as I have mentioned, I don't know whether it came clearly through my presentation. If we look at the self-employed fish vendors and the peeling workers, there are differences in their mobilities. But then when you try to see mobility as autonomy and link it with the household autonomy aspect, then it is more about the cultural context. As you rightly said, the type of work will come, the impact of the type of work on mobility will be captured when you compare, say, self-employed workers and the peeling workers, because both of them have different levels of mobility, because they're totally different types of work. But within the household, what is your autonomy level or your decision-making power in terms of your mobility? That depends on the cultural context. So in my case, since I have focused on the fisheries sector in a particular village, in a particular district of Kerala, definitely that will have a kind of homogeneity within the households, because they belong to, say, the other backward castes or scheduled castes. They have homogeneity in terms of their cultural context. So the movement in terms of social spaces, personal spaces, etc., will be kind of affected or impacted by the cultural context. So if you move to some other state and with a different culture, definitely the household autonomy aspect will be different. So I hope that clarifies your question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Harry Nair, who has a question about the role of the church. So if you can turn on your microphone and ask your question.
Hi, Nikhila. Congratulations on your book. And congratulations to Professor Barrientos. I enjoyed her assessment as well of your book and your presentation. I'm not very well versed with the workers, the informal sector in Kerala, but I have a sense that most of the fisher folk in South Central Kerala are probably Christians. I could be wrong, I don't have the data, but at least a substantial number could belong to the Christian community. And in my own limited sense, what I have noticed in South India, especially in Tamil Nadu, is that the Catholic Church has played a significant role in transforming the condition of Dalits in Tamil Nadu. And this work has been recognized internationally. Maybe it hasn't received the kind of global media coverage with regard to, for example, Kerala, where we talk about the Kerala model of development. But the Catholic Church has done substantial work in Tamil Nadu. So my question, very briefly put, is if it is true that a substantial number of fisher folk do belong to the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, what has been the role of the Church in transforming these communities, or transformational mobility, if that's a concept, if I've understood that well? What has been the role of Church, or has religion worked against transformational mobility? Thank you.
Thank you, Hari. Very interesting and insightful question. Yes, you are right in terms of the religious background of women workers in my case study. They are, as you know, at one point there was en masse conversion of Araya, and there were those Mukkuva community in Kerala. They converted to Christianity, so at various stages. So majority of my women workers in the case study, they belong to the Latin Catholic domination. So yeah, in fact, when I did the in-depth interviews of women workers, I've tried to understand not exactly about the mobility aspect, but in case of violence, because spousal violence was one, symbolic, patriarchal act, which has had a continuous thread across all the households. So, and along in both peeling workers as well as fish vendors. So I was curious to know what, from the religious perspective, what kind of support do they get? Sadly, this is considered a very private matter, and from the church side, most of the women, in fact, many of the fish vendors, I have to interview and do the survey at the church on Sundays, or either in their households, because otherwise they are always on the move. I could never. So it was mostly in churches that I did many of my interviews as well. From morning till evening, we used to sit together, and it was very enriching experience. So they said that the church could not interfere. So there was this kind of clear disconnect between church's interference in the familial matters of, say, spousal violence or alcoholism. Alcoholism is another aspect which was which was there in almost 80% of the households, but women never got support from the church to kind of get over this issue. So the problem still stays. I'm not very sure about why and how of all this, because since that was not my question, but I have noted down that religion is not helping in improving the well-being of women in terms of the patriarchal structures. Probably even within the church, you find a lot of patriarchy at play. So it doesn't come to help women workers and their situation in any sense. So that's my take from my interactions with the women workers. I hope that helps in clarifying your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next question is from Kumiko. If you could turn on your microphone.
Yes. Hi. Congratulations on your book and the presentation. I'm sorry, I apologize in advance that I have not read your book yet, but I really found your presentation interesting and very insightful. And my question, I have two questions. You talked about as a way to promote transformative mobility. Forming a cooperative is one way of realizing it, but India having such a rigid hierarchy and considering other societal and cultural constraints that these women face, I wonder if such an action is feasible. And if so, do you know any good example that I can refer to, so that I can put your work in more sort of a perspective in terms of coming up with a solution? And another question, I don't know if this was being asked in your paper, but if climate change has affected the way these women live and work at all. Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you, Kumiko. Nikhila?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kumiko. Excellent questions. Yes, as you rightly said, forming cooperatives for these peeling workers who are, the first issue is about their fragmented workplaces. They're not together and they're spread across the coastal areas. And some of these workplaces even disappear. So if the peeling shed owner decides that, he's not getting enough raw materials, this work can disappear in a day, because they get the raw materials from Tuticorin in Tamil Nadu most of the time, because they bring huge truckloads of shrimp and squid and etc. early in the morning, and then the work continues, and then they give it to the local export-oriented manufacturing units. So of course it's very difficult to bring, and that is why till date, maybe it's 30 years plus, that they have not been able to come together and make a cooperative to put across their grievances or influence the policy decisions of the government towards their lot. So, but we have very good examples in India, as I think Professor Stephanie has already cited the example of Self-Employed Women's Association. It's called SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association. So this was set up in Gujarat, and and it has helped a lot of workers, heterogeneous type of workers, working in textiles, puppet making, pickle making, variety of work, who are all self-employed. Some of them are home-based workers, HBWs. Some of them are, vendors, street vendors. So now, to that extent, SEVA has grown, the Self-Employed Women's Association, that they do have a bank from where these women can, take money on credit and expand their activities. So we do have examples, but then that kind of synergy of a cooperative effort has to come up in fisheries sector, and there are glimpses of hope in terms of, as I have already mentioned, International Collective in Support of Workers, ICSF. they do have, representatives who come and talk with workers. They take account of the grievances. They put it across to platforms like International Labour Organization, and try to bring about. In fact, as Stephanie was mentioning, not post-COVID, we are still in COVID. So this COVID phase, many fish workers have faced loss of jobs, and they are not getting enough supply of raw materials to have work. So in countries like Chile, they have influenced the government to initiate welfare policies. Like they've set up some kind of fund. I think even in South Africa, they have kind of influenced the government to support them in times of crisis like COVID. In Kerala, what they have done is fish workers, they made it into Essential Services Act. It is an essential service, so they did not have to. They had a lockdown, but after that, they were given exemption to continue their activity so that their livelihoods are safe. So yes, as you rightly said, bringing cooperative effort in such fragmented workers, it is a huge challenge, but we have to do it, and government should also come in between to facilitate collective capabilities. And the second question was on climate change. Yes, it's having huge impact. In fact, in the Kerala fisheries, what has happened is there is a tremendous, one can see the trend in decline in the fisheries capture over the years. We have times when they stop trawlers, because trawlers generally capture huge fish catches at one go, even with the small fish, etc. So it is this kind of climate change impact is very much evident across fisheries sector in Kerala, and so the livelihoods of these women workers who are totally dependent on fisheries sector needs a lot of attention in terms of allowing trawlers or the amount of catch, because when you have mechanized imported technology, it is not like the traditional ones which leave some for the future. At one go, you take huge catches. So these are issues, pertinent issues, which fisheries sector in Kerala is facing. Yes. Thank you. I hope that clarifies. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we've run towards the end of our session. So I wondered if Nikhila or Stephanie had words of conclusion you wanted to add, or?
Yes.
No, just this has been a really fascinating discussion. I think not everyone's had time to read the book, but I thought that the summary that Nikhila provided was very, obviously broad, but she couldn't cover everything. But it was really concise, and I think the points that have been raised are really important in terms of really drilling down and addressing these issues, which needs to be done. And so many workers, particularly women workers, are informal and increasingly so. It's a really critical discussion. So thank you.
Yes, Robert, just a final note. Thank you so much for all those who have participated in this book talk. And I'm extremely grateful to Stephanie for joining us. And I know that it has been a very hectic month for you. And in spite of that, you've joined and given very insightful comments. And thank you so much for that. And of course, Manchester has been the seedbed for my research. So I can never forget Manchester academic community. And finally, Robert, thank you so much. You've been coordinating from New York, Tokyo, and multiple places to accommodate this book talk in spite of your very hectic schedule. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. And thank you all the speakers for giving me the comments, the questions. I really enjoyed this book talk. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Nikhila. And thank you, Stephanie. And we wish you all a very happy late morning or late afternoon or evening, depending on whether you were in Europe, in India or in Japan. So thanks again. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
This is Temple University Japan's ICAST through the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. If you'd like more information and to see our previous archive of events, look to the ICAS website, and also we have an archive on YouTube with previous events. Thanks for joining us today.